Hello, this is Gwen Hill at Pine Ridge Baptist Church Ladies Sunday School Department, and we're looking today at Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis. This chapter, if you wanted to give it a title, the title would be But God. We're looking at the death of Jacob, the death of Joseph. Joseph's God was big enough. He's yours. Before we begin, discuss just a little bit the difference between God's miracles and God's providence. A miracle is when or where God intervenes in natural law, like the parting of the Red Sea or the parting of the Jordan, raising someone from the dead. That is a miracle. There's other miracles. Jesus did a lot of miracles. People in dire straits of disease or disease processes that he brought them back to normal life. All of those are miracles. Providence is when God cooperates with the natural law to effect a supernatural result. In providence, God is manipulating ordinary events to effect an extraordinary outcome. We're going to be looking at those too, and there's a lot of God's providence out there if you look for it and if you'll recognize it as coming straight from Him. A lot of things we look at and we say, how in the world did that happen? Well, if it was a very positive thing, think God's providence. I know we've all, at one time or another, if you're old enough to drive, have had close calls, and you thought later, how in the world did that happen that I didn't get injured? Maybe God's providence. We had a speaker at our church just a while back, maybe a week back, and he spoke about extraneous things. He drove a truck, and extraneous things keeping him from leaving when he expected to leave. He left an hour late, and he was unhappy with that. And then come to find out there was a real bad car accident about an hour ahead of him that had he been on time, highly likely he would have been involved. It was in a chain reaction, a lot of cars involved, and a lot of people were hurt. God's providence. We heard a lot of stories of God's providence on 9/11, people that should have been in the Twin Towers that wasn't, and for unknown reasons why. God knows those reasons why. So let's look for God's providence when we read today's Sunday school lesson. Genesis chapter 50, we're going to start with verses 1, 2, and 3. Then Joseph fell on his father's face, and he wept over him, and he kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Let's break it down just a little bit. Then Joseph fell on his father's face. As the oldest son, who normally gets the right of the firstborn, this would have been his privilege and his honor to do this. Joseph was not the oldest, but he did hold the rights of the firstborn, and as the holder of the firstborn rights, he was the one that got to pay honor to his father first. He fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him, and he would have been the one to close Jacob's eyes. Joseph then turned to his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. It was not normal for Hebrews, and it is still not normal. Hebrews still don't want to be embalmed. They just don't believe that's the right way to do it. But they lived so far away from Canaan, and Jacob wanted to go to Canaan when he died. So to preserve the body, it would have been necessary. It also was a mark of honor that they paid to the Egyptian culture where they lived at this time. They didn't want to thumb their nose at that culture, those people that they lived with. that Joseph worked for. He was still the second in command of Egypt. So that's another reason why he asked the physicians to embalm him. But here's another thing. The physicians didn't usually embalm. It was the priest that did. The priest had a lot of ceremonies that they went through, a lot of chants, a lot of prayers to a lot of little g gods. And Joseph did not want that for his father. His father wouldn't have wanted that either. So he had his own personal physicians to embalm his dad. It took 40 days to embalm somebody. The process took 40 days. And then if you were doing this for a pharaoh, the time of mourning would have been 72 days. But the time of mourning set for Jacob was 70 days. This tells us how much regard, how honored the Egyptians honored Jacob and Joseph. Joseph had been there for 17 years. He had taken them through the years of plenty and the years of famine, and it was now 12 years. The famine had been over with for 12 years. And they held Joseph in very high esteem. Jacob also was held in high esteem. It's inferred that the Pharaoh used him to run all of his livestock and things in Goshen, so he would have had a high regard as well. So they, in their mourning of him, they mourned him for 70 days. That's almost as much as a Pharaoh. So in verse 4, we're going to skip 70 days forward, and this is about Joseph is going to be speaking. Now the days of his mourning were past, and Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I am dying. In my grave which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. Did you notice in verse 4 he said that Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh? Why didn't he just go right straight in and talk to Pharaoh? I mean, he's been second in command now for 17 years. You would think they would have a good rapport. We know that Pharaoh really thought a lot of Joseph. Why didn't he go in and talk? Why did he maybe have the butler speak for him? Why did he do that? Well, he did that because in this culture, if you couldn't maintain a happy attitude, you didn't go in front of the king. Remember, go back to Nehemiah and read how Nehemiah was afraid to go into his king at that time because he was sad about the condition of Jerusalem. Well, Joseph thought it was very good politics not to go into Pharaoh at this time because he was in mourning. It would be hard for him not to appear sad. His father was dead and they were still in a state of mourning. And he said, I need someone to speak to the Pharaoh for me. Let the Pharaoh know. Ask permission for me to go and bury my father. I had to promise my father that I would take him back to Canaan and I would bury him there. And so they did. And in verse 6 through 9, and Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all of the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, in his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a great gathering. All of these people would be like the president's cabinet. In our day and time, it'd be like the United States president, his cabinet. All of them left to go to this funeral. The Pharaoh wanted a huge showing to give the respect to Joseph, and they followed them toward Canaan to bury Jacob. I want you to imagine, if you would, this journey that they're going to be taking. It's about a 2-week trip to go to Canaan, where they're going to bury Jacob. They had all this immense amount of people. They would have had all of these high political fellas and their people with them. They would have had to carry along provisions. They couldn't run into Shoney's or Cracker Barrel or somewhere along the way. They had to carry all their provisions. They had to carry their tents. They had to carry. It was a big production. And then you had Joseph and all of his household. We're told that Joseph had 9 sons. So it would have been Joseph and all of his boys and their families. It would have been all of Joseph's brothers. It would have been all 12 of them and their families and their families. The only people that would have stayed behind would have been people who couldn't make the journey. It would have been the mothers of small children. It would have been shepherds that were deemed necessary to stay and mind the flocks and keep them safe. It would have been the infirm. Everyone else would have went. Pharaoh was practically by himself. He would have also sent an army guard with them because this is his cabinet, and he would have wanted protection for them. It'd be like us sending the Secret Service plus a Marine battalion with them to make sure that they got there and back all right. When they said they took chariots and horsemen, chariots were the military implement of the day. This, you got to remember that Egypt was a powerhouse in their day. They were a superpower of their time. And this was during their big time right now. Genesis 50, 10 through 13. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation, he observed 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is the deep mourning of the Egyptians." And therefore its name was called Abel Mizraim, and which is beyond the Jordan. When they say beyond the Jordan, remember the maps that we studied last week. Beyond the Jordan would have them in what would become Israel. It's in Canaan. It would be in Israel, and it would be in the land of Benjamin, Judah, right around in there. That's where they were headed for. All right, and then the normal way for Hebrew culture was to bury within 24 hours of death. Well, we now know that it took 72 hours of mourning in Egypt, plus a 2-week journey, at least a 2-week journey to get there. And so now Joseph wants to observe the normal for the Hebrew culture was to mourn for 7 days after someone had died. And so now they're mourning Dad. And when the inhabitants of the land saw it, all they saw was this vast, to them, a vast army of Egyptians fully geared out because they were there on a protective duty. They would have seen all the mightily dressed, richly dressed Egyptians. They would have known these were rich and powerful people. And I imagine Joseph was arrayed just that way too. And they were impressed. They were very impressed. They renamed the area for him. So they buried him in the same cave that Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob would now be buried, and also Leah was buried there. So verse 14, and after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who went with him to bury his father. You got to remember, he was 17 years old when he left this country before. This would have been going home. This would have been very bittersweet for him. He's there to bury his father. That's sadness enough. But he looks around, if this is the land that he knows that God has promised his people, and he's having to leave again. But he told Pharaoh he would. He knows from what God had told Abraham that his people would be imprisoned for about, or enslaved for about 400 years. He knew this. I don't know if he told anyone else. I don't know how much Jacob had told everybody else. But around those campfires where they repeated their history, their oral history, I'm sure that they all heard it. Whether they retained it and associated it with what was going on or not, I don't know. But they all went back to Egypt. They had an opportunity not to. The brothers did. But Joseph went, and he told Pharaoh he would come back, and he did. Now, verse 15 is one of the saddest, starting to recount one of the saddest episodes, I think, in Genesis. Genesis 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us all the evil which we did to him." They've had this internal discussion and probably started right after Jacob's death, letting needles of fear and guilt bother them. Have you ever done something to someone that you were ashamed of yourself for doing? Even if that person forgives you, it's hard for you to forgive yourself. You think, why did I do that? I wish I could go back and change that. That's where the brothers were at now. We tend, when we're in a situation of guilt like that, to project onto others how we would feel if someone did us like we did them. You know, Satan uses our guilt to steal our joy. And these men had already asked Joseph for forgiveness, and he had told them that he had forgiven them. He's taken care of them for 17 years. He's made sure they had food to eat, that they were taken care of, not just with food, but a place for them to live, a place to graze their animals. Remember, they came to him because they were starving. And they've been doing well enough that even after the famine was over, they elected to continue staying under the protection of Joseph in Goshen. Goshen was a great place, and they liked it. Excuse me. But you know, when you hurt a loved one, as bad as they know it would have hurt Jacob, even if that person forgives you, it's human nature to carry some guilt. But you know, guilt distorts reality. And a lot of people try to run from guilt. But guilt is in your brain, it's in your head, it's in your soul. And unless you can turn it loose and give it all to God, you'll take it with you wherever you go. Verse 16 and 17. So they, the brothers, sent messengers to Joseph, saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, Thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespasses of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke it to him. Well, the brothers may have grown some, but they've not grown anywhere near where they should be. They expect Jacob to do to them like they did to him. They've had evidence for 17 years that he wasn't holding a grudge, but they just can't get past it in their own heart. So they sent a messenger. They were too chicken to go talk to him themselves. They sent messengers to Joseph. And that messenger stood in front of Joseph and said, "I've got a message from your brothers, and this is what they wanted me to say to you." And it was a pack of stories, lies to be factual. Jacob was a strong man, and if he could lay on his deathbed and look at his sons and say, "No, Reuben, you're as unstable as water. No, Simon, Levi, I don't want to even know what you're doing. You're so evil. All your counsel has been in evil. You're murderers. If he was strong enough to do all of that, believe me, he was strong enough to talk to Jacob in his own way. If Jacob had really wanted to speak to Joseph, if he wanted to plead the brother's case. This didn't come from Jacob. I feel sure it didn't. And I feel sure that that Joseph knew this too. I'll be glad when we get in some names that's not J's. I get them mixed up. Okay. They also brought God into it. If you won't forgive us for our sake, you won't forgive us for our Father's sake, we serve the same God that you do. Let's do it for God's sake. Ooh, they were dropping on some big toes here. And Joseph, as he listened to him, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. All this time, and yet they still didn't trust him. All this time, and they had been this unsure and this afraid of him, and it made him weep. You know, have you ever asked God to forgive you of something? And if you're like me, then a few days, weeks go by, and you get to thinking and dwelling on that again, and you ask the Lord again to forgive you. That's kind of insulting to God. He says, why are you asking me to forgive you again? He said, I forgave you long ago and threw it away. Don't even think of it anymore until you bring it up to me again. Do you not think that my forgiveness is real? That's kind of what Joseph was feeling. Kind of like what God would when we throw his forgiveness in his face, when we come back and ask a second time, or a third, or a fourth. We need to trust his word. In Proverbs chapter 29, verse 25 says, fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord will be safe. I like that. Genesis 50, 18 through 21. When his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. And Joseph said to them, don't be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them, and he spoke kindly to them. The messengers went back and told the brothers of Joseph's reaction. So they got brave enough to go in front of Joseph. And they pledged their loyalty to him. We're your servants. And he just shook his head and he said, don't be afraid of me. I'm not the one to punish you. I'm not God. You know, we should never seek revenge, because you can't read that other person's heart. You can't read their minds. You don't know for sure exactly what they were thinking or feeling that day, or circumstances surrounding that. It's God's business, because God knows all. And let God handle it. I need to back up here just a minute. God does want peace, and he does want order, and he does give laws with results for civil trials and civil disobedience and civil disorder to be punished. He's not for a do whatever you want to society. There has to be order, and there's consequences for what we do. But it's not the person harmed that does the judging. It's an impartial third party. God does not want us to do revenge, but he does want a peaceful legal society. And he tells them, he says, don't be afraid. As long as I'm alive and hold this position, I will take care of you and your little ones, your families. I will be your advocate here in Egypt. Verse 22 is approximately 55 years later. It's verse 22 through 24. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. He came to Egypt when he was 17 years old. It's now he's 110. So that means he has spent 93 years in Egypt. He has spent 63 years in authority, the second in command. Verse 23, Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knee. Joseph got to watch 4 generations all told growing up. That's a pretty big deal. The reason that this Machir, Machir, was mentioned, he is going to be an important, prominent person in the tribe of Manasseh that we'll read about a little later. They just want to let you know, Moses, as he wrote this, wanted to let you know that Machir, Manasseh's grandson, our son, knew Joseph and was counseled by Joseph. In verse 24, Joseph said to his brother, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He's on his deathbed now. He's called his family in to him. Verse 25, then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph died like he lived, trusting and believing in his God. He knew God would bring them out of Egypt. God had said he would, and God always keeps his word. The family remembered him and did as he asked, and carried his bones to Canaan when they left Egypt. Joseph is telling them, don't give up and settle here. Consider this a sojourn, because God is going to bring you out. Don't lose faith. You know, Joseph, at 110 years old, might have been talking to his nephews. He may have already lost a lot of his brothers, or several of his brothers may have been standing around his deathbed. Ephraim and Manasseh were there, I'm sure. You know, as they heard him, I'm sure they wondered what a future was going to be like without Joseph. Joseph is giving them a reminder here that God has not forgotten them. He has not forgotten them. What a wonderful reminder for you and I that God's not forgotten you either. He's coming back. I personally think it could be before we finish this lesson. I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you next week when we enter Exodus. Good night.